She was surrounded by 5 men in a dark park, and she refused to break. He was just a maintenance worker heading to his truck. But the moment one of those men grabbed her arm and started pulling her toward the darkness, something behind his eyes went very, very quiet. Not the quiet of a man who was afraid. The quiet of a man who had been trained to end situations exactly like this one. They saw a worn jacket. They saw work boots. They saw someone they could ignore. They had no idea what they had just invited into that circle of lamplight. And by the time they figured it out, it was already over. If you're watching this story for the first time, welcome. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss what comes next, and tap the like button if you want more stories like this one. And drop a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Now settle in. This one's going to stay with you. The charity gala at the Meridian Grand had been Brielle Langford's idea of a necessary evil. She'd written the check 6 weeks ago, a substantial one, because the children's hospital expansion genuinely needed the funding, and she believed in the cause, but the event itself, the small talk and the careful smiling and the slow progression of men who wanted to discuss her company's valuation over their second glass of scotch, had ground her down in the way that 3 hours of actual work never could. By 9:15, she'd done what she came to do. She'd shaken the right hands, said the right things, and politely declined 2 invitations to continue the evening elsewhere. Her security team had driven her to the venue in a black SUV, but Marcus, her lead detail, had radioed 20 minutes ago with a problem. A rear tire had blown out on the parking structure's lower level, and the backup vehicle was 12 minutes out. "Stay inside, Miss Langford," Marcus had told her. "We'll have this sorted." Brielle had nodded. Then she'd looked across the lobby toward the tall glass doors and the empty sidewalk beyond and done a private calculation. The parking structure was 4 blocks away. The route cut through Hawthorne Park, which she'd walked 100 times over the years. It was a cold October Thursday, nearly 10 o'clock, and the park would be close to empty. She was wearing flat shoes. She'd made that executive decision years ago when she realized heels were a structural disadvantage masquerading as a professional expectation. She had her phone. She had her bag. She was 31 years old and had been making her own decisions since she was 19. She told the valet she was stepping out for air and started walking. The park was beautiful in the cold. That was the thing nobody mentioned about Seattle in October, the way the lamplight turned wet pavement into something that almost looked like it was glowing. The leaves were mostly down now, and they collected in the corners of the stone pathways in dark, flattened layers. Her breath came in thin clouds. Somewhere across the park, a dog was barking at something, and then it stopped. Brielle was halfway through past the stone fountain, moving toward the east exit that opened onto the parking structure's street, when she noticed the man on the path to her left. He wasn't jogging. He wasn't walking with purpose, the way someone crossing a park does when they have somewhere to be. He was just moving, slowly, in her direction but not toward the exit. Kept her pace steady and glanced right without turning her head. There was another one, different path, same slow drift. She had been the CEO of a medical technology company for 3 years. Before that, she'd been its chief operating officer, and before that, she'd worked 18-hour days building its financial infrastructure from a rented office space above a dry cleaner in Belltown. She had sat across from hostile investors and predatory acquisition teams, and one particularly aggressive competitor who had tried to poach her entire engineering department in a single weekend. She knew when something was wrong before she could articulate why. Her phone was already in her hand when the third man appeared. Came from behind the fountain, not running, just stepping into the lamplight like he'd been waiting there the whole time. 'Cause he had been. Brielle stopped walking, not out of panic, out of the cold recognition that stopping gave her more information than moving would. There were 5 of them. She counted the others as they closed in from the edges of the path, pulling black cloth up over their faces with the practiced ease of men who'd done this before. They wore dark clothes, dark shoes, nothing reflective. They'd positioned themselves with real care, too, behind her, cutting off the way she'd come, 2 flanking at diagonal angles, the third from the fountain, now moving to complete the circle. She had maybe 8 feet of open ground in any direction, and every foot was accounted for. The one from the fountain seemed to be in charge. He was the tallest, and he moved with a particular kind of unhurried confidence that was worse. Somehow, then aggression would have been. Phone, he said. His voice was flat. This was work to him. Brielle's thumb was already moving. She pressed send on the emergency text to Marcus Hawthorne Park, East Path, 5 men before she dropped the phone into her bag and held the bag out. Purse, the man said. Phone, jewelry, and the tablet. Tablet. She felt something shift in her chest. Not fear exactly. Something sharper. The company tablet was in a slim case inside her bag. It was encrypted with a 12-character passcode, and it contained, among other things, 47 pages of preliminary audit documentation that her internal finance team had quietly been building for 6 weeks. If those files were what she thought they would change everything about how North Star Medical Systems moved forward. She had not told anyone outside her own office what was on it. Not even Marcus. She handed over the bag. She unclipped the bracelet her mother had given her. She did all of it calmly, because she had already decided that she would give them everything except the code. The leader took the tablet out of the case and looked at it. Screen demanded authentication. Unlock it, he said. No. The word came out of her more steadily than she expected. He tilted his head slightly. Unlock it, or we do this a different way. Then you'll have to do it a different way, Brielle said. Because I'm not unlocking it. There was a moment of silence between them, not the silence of hesitation, but the kind that comes right before something changes. The man on her left shifted his weight. One of the men behind her moved a half step closer. And then, from somewhere across the park, a voice said, "Hey." Elias Mercer had been awake since 5:30 that morning. He'd made Sadie's lunch before she left for school: peanut butter, crackers, apple slices, and a folded note that she had been pretending not to read but definitely read, because he'd caught her smiling at one once, and she'd immediately shoved it under her sandwich. He'd driven her to school, stopped at a job site near the waterfront for a 6-hour maintenance contract, picked Sadie up, dropped her at his mother-in-law's apartment 3 blocks away, and driven back out for a 3-hour evening job at the Garfield Community Center on the park's north side. Now it was 9:42, and he was walking toward his truck. He was 37 years old. He was wearing work pants that had seen better days, a thermal undershirt, and a worn brown canvas jacket that he'd bought at an outdoor surplus store 4 years ago for $40. He had a thermos of cold coffee in one hand and his keys in the other, and he was thinking specifically about whether Sadie's science project was actually due Friday, or if she'd somehow convinced herself it was due next week and was going to be devastated when he asked about it tonight. He saw the woman first. She was standing on the east path near the stone fountain, and something in her posture caught his attention before he registered why. She wasn't walking. She wasn't sitting. She was standing completely still in the way that people only stand still when their body has made a decision and is waiting for their brain to catch up. Then he saw the men around her. Elias stopped walking. He had spent 11 years in the Navy's special warfare community. He'd been deployed to places whose names he couldn't legally say at dinner tables, and he'd run operations that required him to read a situation and produce an output in the time it took other people to realize there was a situation at all. He'd left all of that behind 6 years ago, when his wife died and his daughter was 3, and the math became very simple. The world had enough operators, and Sadie had only one father. But the math in front of him was also simple. 5 men. 1 woman. A park that was otherwise empty. He pressed the emergency call icon on his phone and kept his voice low and precise. Location, number of individuals, description of their clothing and positions. The dispatcher started to tell him to stay back and wait for officers, and he said, "I understand," and put the phone in his jacket pocket without ending the call. He watched one of the men reach out and close his hand around the woman's upper arm. Elias set his thermos down on a nearby bench. He took off his jacket. He folded it in an automatic, almost absurd gesture that he couldn't have explained and placed it on the bench beside the thermos. Then he walked into the lamplight and said, "Hey." The 5 men turned to look at him. In the light, he could see them register what they were looking at. A man in work clothes, no weapon visible, walking toward them at a pace that was neither hurried nor cautious. Just steady. The way people walk when they've decided something. The leader's eyes moved over him quickly. Whatever he was looking for, Elias apparently didn't have it. "Keep moving," the leader said. Elias didn't stop. He came to about 10 feet from the circle's edge, and then he did stop on his own terms, not because of the instruction. "Let her go," he said. His voice was even, not aggressive, not performed. It was the voice of a man who was used to saying things once and meaning them. One of the men on the outside of the circle laughed. Not a nervous laugh, a genuinely amused one. "What are you going to do about it, man?" Elias didn't answer that. His eyes were moving. The woman could see it. She could see him scanning the space between each man. The distances, the angles, the footing on the wet stone path. He looked at the lamp poles and the benches and the tree line. He wasn't performing confidence. He was doing something practical, and the efficiency of it was more unsettling than bluster would have been. "Last time," the leader said, "walk away." "I'm not going to do that," Elias said. The youngest-looking one, a man on Elias's left with a slight, impatient energy, broke from the group and came at him fast, not telegraphing, not posturing, just moving. Brielle later tried to describe to investigators what happened in the next 45 seconds, and she struggled with it because the vocabulary she had didn't quite fit. She'd expected a fight, two men swinging, noise, chaos. What she watched instead was something that looked almost architectural. The man who came at Elias reached him, and then he wasn't reaching him anymore. There was a movement she couldn't fully track, a use of momentum and angle, and the attacker was on the ground with one arm bent at a direction arms weren't designed to go. Elias didn't stand over him. He didn't look at him. He was already moving toward Brielle. "Come with me," he said. "Now. Don't run." He walked her arm across her back, guiding firmly toward the stone fountain, which sat about 12 feet off the main path. He moved her to the fountain's far side, putting 3 feet of solid stone between her and the rest of the group. "Stay low and stay behind this," he said quietly. "Don't come out unless I tell you to." Brielle crouched. She looked at him. "Who are you?" "Someone who called the police before he walked over here." He glanced at her. "How long has your security team known where you are?" 4 minutes, maybe." He nodded. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were completely calm. "Then we need about 4 more minutes." What happened in those 4 minutes was not elegant. There was nothing cinematic about it. One man caught Elias across the cheek with a wild swing and opened a cut below his eye. Another managed to get behind him briefly before Elias stepped sideways into a narrow gap between 2 benches that made the flanking angle impossible. He wasn't winning so much as managing keeping the remaining men from organizing, using the park's geography the way water finds low ground, moving to wherever the threat was most immediate. Brielle watched all of it from behind the fountain. She noticed that he was always aware of where she was. Even mid-movement, mid-struggle, there was a fraction of his attention that stayed oriented to her position. If a man drifted toward the fountain, Elias was already redirecting before she had time to feel afraid. That was what she kept coming back to later. Not the competence. The intention behind it. He wasn't fighting for himself. Then the leader, who had stayed back, watching with the calm of a man calculating, reached down and picked up the tablet that had fallen from Brielle's bag. He looked at Elias. He looked at Brielle. "Tell your friend something," he said to Brielle. His voice had changed. The flat professionalism had been replaced by something colder. "Tell him this wasn't random." Elias had gone still. 2 of the remaining men had fallen back, and the third had retreated to the leader's side. "Someone told us you'd be crossing this park tonight," the leader continued. "Someone who knows your schedule. Someone who told us exactly what's on this tablet and why they need it." He held up the device. "You have a problem inside your own company, Ms. Langford. And whoever it is they already know tonight didn't go the way they planned." He turned and walked toward the service road at the park's south edge, and the remaining men followed. In the distance, the first sirens had begun. Brielle came out from behind the fountain. Elias was standing at the edge of the lamplight, watching the direction they'd gone. His cheek was bleeding in a thin, dark line, and he was pressing 2 fingers to it without looking at it, the way people do when they're not particularly bothered by the fact of the wound. "Are you okay?" Brielle asked. He turned and looked at her with an expression that suggested the question. Struck him as slightly beside the point. "You?" he said. "I'm fine." She was surprised to find that was mostly true. "You called the police before you came over?" "Yes." "Before you knew what was happening?" "I knew enough," he said. She looked at him in the lamplight, the work clothes, the cut on his face, the folded jacket he'd left on a bench, as though he'd planned to come back for it. He wasn't looking at her with the expression she'd seen on men who wanted something from her. He wasn't managing her reaction or building toward a request. He just looked tired. "You have a phone?" he said. "Marcus is all ready. Call them anyway. Tell them you're at the East Fountain." He picked up his thermos from where he'd set it and looked back across the park. "You should have someone with you when you talk to the police." Brielle watched him. "Are you going to wait?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yeah, I'll wait." He sat down on the bench beside his folded jacket, and he held the cold thermos in both hands, and he waited. The sirens got closer, and in the silence between them two strangers in a park, the damage still visible in the lamplight around them, Brielle Langford found herself thinking about the way he'd moved her behind that fountain. Not because she needed the protection, but because she understood, for the first time, the difference between someone securing a perimeter and someone keeping a person safe. They were not the same thing, and she didn't know yet that the man sitting on that bench with a cut on his cheek and a thermos of cold coffee had a 9-year-old daughter waiting for him 3 blocks away, or that everything he'd just done in this park had felt to him less like heroism and more like a debt he owed to the version of himself he'd worked very hard to put behind him. She didn't know any of that. The blue and red lights were sweeping into the park now, and officers were moving toward them, and the man on the bench stood up without being asked and went to meet them first, so she wouldn't have to walk out there alone. The first officer to reach them was young mid-20s, maybe, with the kind of careful professionalism that hadn't yet been worn smooth by years of the job. He came in with his hand near his holster and his eyes moving fast across the scene. The woman standing near the fountain, the man with the cut on his face, the bench with the folded jacket, scattered signs of what had happened across the wet stone path. One of the men Elias had put down was still on the ground near the east walkway, sitting up now with his wrist cradled against his chest and his mask pulled down, looking like someone who had arrived at the evening with a plan and was only now beginning to understand how badly it had failed. "Ma'am," the officer said. "Are you injured?" "I'm fine," Brielle said. "He needs something for his face." The officer looked at Elias, who shook his head once. "It's superficial," Elias said. He said it the way people say things when they genuinely don't want to talk about it anymore. 2 more units pulled up to the park's east entrance, and then another from the north side, and the quiet that had held the park for the last several minutes dissolved into radio traffic and flashlight beams sweeping across the pathway. A paramedic unit arrived 4 minutes later. Elias sat on the bench while a young woman cleaned the cut on his cheek with a patience he clearly found excessive, and he answered the officer's questions in the flat, sequential way of someone who had given statements before time: location, number of individuals, direction of retreat, physical description of each one, the exact words the leader had said before he walked away with the tablet. The officers wrote everything down. One of them kept glancing at Elias the way people look at something they can't quite categorize. Brielle stood 15 feet away, on the phone with Marcus, who had arrived at the park's north entrance and was making his way across the grass at a pace that suggested he was doing his best not to run. She watched Elias talk to the officers and thought about the leader's words again. "Someone told us you'd be crossing this park tonight. Someone who knows your schedule." Marcus reached her before she'd finished processing that sentence. He was a big man, 6'2", broad, with the kind of composure that came from a decade of executive protection work, and right now he looked shaken in the particular way of professionals who have failed at the one thing they were hired not to fail at. "Ms. Langford," he said. He looked her over the way paramedics do, checking for things people don't always notice about themselves. "I told you I was fine," she said. "You left the building without telling me." "I left the building because you were dealing with a tire and I was 4 blocks from the car." "That's exactly the situation where you tell me." His voice stayed controlled, but there was something underneath it. "That's the entire point of telling me." Brielle looked at him. She knew he was right. She also knew that the particular brand of independence she'd built her identity around had walked her directly into the middle of a coordinated ambush, and the reason she was standing here unharmed was not her own resourcefulness. "I know," she said. Marcus blinked. He'd expected a longer argument. "Okay," he said carefully. "The man over there on the bench," she said. "He's the one who called it in. He's also the one who got me behind cover and kept them off me until your people showed up." She paused. I want you to make sure the officers understand that. Marcus looked across at Elias. Who is he? I don't know yet. His name came out in pieces over the next 40 minutes. The way things do when you're standing in a park at 10:30 at night, talking to police investigators, while a paramedic repeatedly suggests you should probably go to an emergency room, and you repeatedly decline. Elias Mercer, 37, lived in the Eastlake neighborhood north of the park. Self-employed maintenance contractor, residential and commercial, mostly referral work. He'd been finishing a job at the Garfield Community Center, which investigators confirmed with a single call. He'd been walking to his truck when he spotted the situation developing and dialed emergency services before he crossed the grass. One of the senior investigators, a woman named Detective Paulson, with 20 years in and the kind of permanently skeptical expression that comes with them, pulled Brielle aside while her partner was still talking to Elias. You said the man who led the group made a statement before he left, Paulson said. I want you to walk me through it exactly. Brielle did. She had a good memory for language. It was one of the things that made her effective in boardrooms, where people said things they later tried to walk back, and she repeated it as close to verbatim as she could. Someone told us you'd be crossing this park tonight. Someone who knows your schedule. You have a problem inside your own company. Paulson's expression didn't change, but she wrote more slowly than she had before. The tablet they took, she said. What's on it? Preliminary audit documentation. Auditing what? Brielle looked at her steadily. That's what I'm still trying to determine. But it's significant enough that someone arranged tonight to make sure I couldn't finish determining it. Paulson let a beat pass. Do you have a backup of those files? Encrypted, server-side, behind a firewall that requires two-factor authentication from 3 separate administrators. Brielle paused. They can have the tablet. They're not getting those files. Someone inside your company gave these men your schedule for tonight, Paulson said. Not a question. That's what I'm working from, yes. Paulson looked across at Elias, who had finished with her partner and was now standing with his hands in his pockets, waiting. Your witness has an interesting background, she said. What do you mean? My partner ran his name when he gave his ID. She glanced back at her notepad. Prior military. Left active service about 6 years ago. She looked at Brielle. I've interviewed a lot of people who got in the middle of situations like this. Most of them can't describe much beyond a general impression. Mr. Mercer gave us compass directions. Brielle said nothing. I'm not saying that's a problem, Paulson said. I'm saying it's notable. She clicked her pen. We'll need you both to come in tomorrow morning for full statements. Tonight, go somewhere secure, not home, somewhere your security team has already vetted. And don't discuss the contents of that tablet with anyone in your company until I've had a chance to talk to you further. I understand, Miss Langford. Paulson's voice dropped slightly. Whoever arranged this knew enough about your schedule, your route, and your cargo to organize 5 men on a weeknight. That's not a casual operation. You should take it seriously. I already am, Brielle said. She found Elias where she'd left him, at the bench with his jacket, which he had finally put back on against the cold. He was looking at his phone, and she could tell by the way he was holding it that he was deciding whether to call someone. Your daughter? Brielle asked. He looked up. Whatever he'd expected her to say, it wasn't that. Her grandmother's phone number is in my call log, he said. Called to check in earlier. He put the phone in his pocket. She's fine. She doesn't know anything happened. How old is she? 9. He said it the way people say things that they know represent the most important fact about them. Her name's Sadie. Brielle sat on the bench. Not because she was tired, but because standing felt like a performance she didn't have the energy for right now. Cold from the stone seeped through her coat. I don't know how to thank you, she said. Elias shook his head. You don't need to. That's not how this works. It is for me. He wasn't being modest, he was stating a position. She looked at him in the light, the work clothes, the pragmatic face, the cut that the paramedic had finally sealed with a thin adhesive strip. He had the particular kind of stillness that some people have after something intense has ended, not the stillness of shock, but of a body that's been running hot and is now deliberately downshifting. The detective told me you have a military background, she said. Something moved across his expression, not quite discomfort, but close. She ran my name, he said. Is that a problem? No. He was quiet for a moment. Just not what I am anymore. Brielle wanted to ask what that meant. She had about 12 follow-up questions and social instincts to know she shouldn't ask any of them. Not here. Not tonight. The man who took my tablet, she said instead. He knew things he shouldn't have known. Yeah. He knew my name. Elias looked at her. She said. Before the end, Ms. Langford. Not lady, are you my name? She watched his face. He also knew I was carrying the tablet specifically. Not just that I had a company device, that I was carrying that device tonight in a bag. Someone briefed him, Elias said. Someone with access to my personal calendar and detailed knowledge of what I was transporting. She heard how it sounded. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you've got a social justice problem, he said. And it sounds like you already know who it might be. She didn't confirm that, but she didn't deny it either. Across the park, investigators were photographing the path where the confrontation had happened. One of the men who'd been left behind, the one whose wrist Elias had broken in the opening seconds, was being helped into a police vehicle. He hadn't said anything to the officers except that he wanted a lawyer, which at least told Brielle that he was experienced enough to know the situation he was in. I need to get to my office, she said. Elias frowned slightly. Tonight, there are files I need to access before. She stopped. Before someone inside my company realizes tonight failed and moves to the next step. Yes, tonight. My security team is the people who work for me, she said. One of the things that man told me is that someone in my company sent him there. Can't walk into North Star right now and assume that every person in that building is on my side. Elias was quiet. He was working through something. She could tell not the logic of what she'd said, which he'd followed immediately, but something else. What do you need? He finally said. I need to get into the building without announcing my arrival. I need 30 minutes on a secured terminal to verify that certain files are still intact and log access records before anyone has a chance to alter them. And you can't call someone to help you with that? I can call the detective. She told me not to discuss the tablet with anyone in my company. The detective has to follow procedures, Brielle said, which means documentation, coordination, warrants if the situation develops that way. If someone inside North Star is monitoring internal access and they see police activity on our network before we've secured everything, she stopped. There's a window right now. Whoever arranged tonight is waiting to find out if it worked. They don't know yet that those men are in custody. That window is maybe 90 minutes. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked across the park. I have to make a call, he said. He stood up and walked about 20 feet away, and she watched him dial and wait. Conversation was brief. She caught fragments. Yeah, I'm okay. No, everything's fine. I'll be a little later than I thought. Can she stay until a pause? I know. I'll explain later. Thanks, Helen. He came back. My daughter's grandmother, he said. Stay with Sadie. You don't have to. I know I don't. He picked up his jacket from the bench. You said 30 minutes. Maybe 40. Where's your security team right now? Marcus is here. The rest of the team is at the venue, probably. Can you trust Marcus? She thought about it. He's worked for me for 2 years. He's cleared background checks that would make your former colleagues nervous. And he's currently angrier with himself than he is with anyone else, which means he's in exactly the right frame of mind. She paused. Yes, I trust Marcus. Tell him where we're going and why. Don't tell anyone else. He looked at her. And I'm not going in. I'll be outside. This isn't my situation to manage. It's yours. She nodded. I'm just making sure, he said, that you get there in one piece. The drive to North Star's headquarters took 11 minutes. Marcus drove. Brielle sat in the back with Elias, who spent most of the drive looking out the window at the passing streets, with an expression she was starting to recognize as his thinking face, not blank, but turned inward, processing. The man who led them, Elias said about 6 minutes into the drive. He waited. Brielle looked at him. During the confrontation, he said, 4 of them engaged. He stepped back and watched. He didn't commit until the end, when he picked up the tablet. He turned from the window. That's a management structure, not a street crew. Someone higher than those 4 put him in charge and gave him specific instructions about that tablet. And specific instructions about what to do if the robbery failed, Brielle said slowly. Right. Walk away. Deliver the message. Let the system know the approach has to change. He wasn't there to hurt me, she said. The realization settled. Not primarily. The robbery was the cover, the tablet was the objective. And when it didn't work, Elias shrugged. He improvised the message. Told you enough to make you scared without telling you anything actionable. He paused. Except he told you one thing he probably didn't intend to. She waited. That whoever is behind this can't access those files directly, Elias said. If they could, they wouldn't need the physical device. They'd have already taken what they needed. He looked at her. Your security architecture is working. They can't break in from the inside. So they tried to get you to hand it over yourself. Brielle felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized was tightened. The server-side encryption requires authentication from 3 administrators. How many people know that? In detail? 2, myself and our head of IT infrastructure. Then whoever arranged tonight doesn't have full access to your systems, Elias said. They have enough access to read your calendar and know you were carrying that device. But they can't touch the files themselves, which means they're panicking, Brielle said. Yeah, careful people don't hire 5 men to rob someone in a public park. He looked out the window again. That was a desperate move. North Star Medical Systems occupied the top 4 floors of a glass and steel tower on 2nd Avenue, and at 10:45 on a Thursday night, the building's lobby was staffed by 2 security guards who worked for a contracted firm and had no particular loyalty to anyone except their shift supervisors. Marcus had called ahead with a carefully worded story about a forgotten item and a time-sensitive client document, and the guards let them through with the mild incuriosity of people who had been doing overnight desk work long enough to stop caring about the specifics. Elias waited in the lobby as he'd said he would. He sat in one of the low chairs near the entrance with his jacket on and his phone in his hand, and the guards glanced at him once and then went back to their screens. Brielle took the elevator to the 23rd floor with Marcus. The executive level at this hour was exactly what she'd expected, empty, dim, the kind of quiet that large offices get at night when they lose the ambient hum of 60 people doing things. Emergency lighting kept the corridors functional. Her own office was dark, and she left it dark, working entirely from her desktop terminal with the blinds already closed. She logged in with her credentials and then the secondary authentication layer that required her thumbprint and a rotating code from a separate hardware token she kept on her keychain. The system accepted both without delay. The audit files were still there. All 47 pages of preliminary documentation, timestamped and intact, sitting in an encrypted partition that required the same 3 administrator protocol to open fully. She didn't open them. She was looking for something else. Pulled the access log for that partition. In the last 72 hours, the partition had been pinged 11 times from a single internal workstation. Not opened the encryption would have prevented that, but the system had recorded attempts to query the file directory. Someone had been trying to determine what was in there and how to get to it, and they'd been doing it from a workstation on the 18th floor. The 18th floor was finance. Brielle sat back in her chair. Chief Financial Officer's office was on the 18th floor. His name was Dorian Kessler, and he had been with North Star for 4 years, and he sat 3 chairs away from Brielle at every executive meeting. And he had given a very polished speech at the company's last quarterly review about fiscal responsibility and institutional transparency. She stared at the access log for a long moment. Then she forwarded it encrypted, with a cover message that contained nothing except a reference number and Detective Paulson's direct line to a private email address that had no connection to Norse servers. Then she logged out, cleared the session, and sat in the dark for about 30 seconds. She thought about the man downstairs in the lobby chair, who had taken off his jacket and folded it on a park bench before walking into a circle of 5 armed men, because he'd decided he wasn't going to be the person who walked past. She thought about Sadie's grandmother, who was probably watching television in a small apartment somewhere nearby while a 9-year-old slept in a guest room and didn't know that her father had spent the last 2 hours doing something he'd promised himself he was done with. She thought about Dorian Kessler, who had sat in meetings with her for 4 years and looked her in the eye and discussed quarterly projections, and apparently spent those same 4 years building a financial structure inside her company that was designed to benefit everyone except the people it was supposed to serve. She was angry. She was the specific kind of angry that doesn't express itself as heat, it comes in cold, and it clarifies everything. She stood up and went back to the elevator. Marcus was waiting for her in the corridor. He didn't ask what she'd found. He read her face and said, "Do you need anything else from this floor?" "No," she said. "We're done here." In the elevator, he said, "Should I call Paulson?" "I already sent her what she needs. She'll move when she's ready." Brielle looked at the floor numbers descending. "In the meantime, I need you to quietly pull Dorian Kessler's building access logs for the last 30 days and have them ready for when she calls. Don't go through the normal channels. Use the IT contact I gave you when we set up the new security protocol in March." "Only that contact." "Understood." He paused. "You knew it was him?" "I suspected someone in finance," she said. "I didn't know it was specifically Dorian until 20 minutes ago." "And the preliminary audit is exactly what I thought it was," she said. "Which means there's a lot more than 47 pages worth of documentation waiting to be built." The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened, and Elias looked up from his phone as they came out. He read Brielle the way he'd read the park, quickly and without broadcasting the assessment. "You found what you were looking for," he said. "Yes." He stood. "Okay." He pulled his jacket straight. "Then we should get you somewhere safe for the night." "I have a list of options," Marcus prepared. "Good." They walked toward the lobby doors. One of the security guards nodded as they passed. Outside, the Seattle night was cold and wet, the streets slick under the overhead lights, the kind of night that makes the city look like a film set if you catch it at the right angle. Elias stopped on the sidewalk. He looked at her. "The man who took your tablet," he said. He said, "Whoever's behind this already knows tonight failed." "Yes. That means they know the robbery didn't work. They don't know yet whether those men said anything before they were picked up." He looked down the street. "But they're going to start calculating their options. And one of those options is going to be that you already know who it is." "I know," Brielle said. "So whatever you sent to the detective has to move fast." "Yes." She looked at him. "I've been in a company that was bleeding from the inside for 6 weeks. I've been building a case document by document because I didn't have enough yet to move on." She paused. "Tonight changed that. Tonight they made a mistake they can't undo." Elias was quiet. "Because of you," she added. He shook his head slightly. Not denial, more like he found the framing uncomfortable. "I called the police and walked across a park," he said. "You moved me behind cover before the second man had even turned around," she said. "You positioned yourself between me and every threat in that space for 4 minutes without once leaving an angle unprotected. You didn't fight those men. You managed them." She looked at him directly. "That's not something people do because they called the police and walked across a park." He didn't respond to that. She let it sit. "Is your face okay?" she asked. He touched the adhesive strip below his eye. "It's fine. You should put ice on it when you get home. I'm aware of how bruising works." "I'm sure you are," she said. "Put ice on it anyway." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like a smile's opening movement, before he decided not to follow through. Marcus brought the car around, and they stood in the cold air on the sidewalk until it arrived. And Brielle thought about how strange it was that she felt calmer right now than she had at any point during the charity gala. She was dealing with corporate fraud, a coordinated assault, a compromised organization, and a situation that was going to become very complicated very quickly, and she felt calm. She suspected that had something to do with the man standing next to her on the sidewalk, who had no stake in any of this except the one he'd manufactured for himself by walking across a park. Car arrived. Elias opened the door for her not as a performance, just automatically, and she got in, and then she looked up at him. "Your daughter," she said. "Sadie." "Yeah, she doesn't know any of this happened." "No." Brielle looked at him for a moment. "Good," she said. "She shouldn't have to." Something in his face changed then briefly, before he got it under control. It was the look of someone who'd been handed something they weren't expecting and weren't quite sure what to do with. Closed the door. Marcus pulled away from the curb, and Brielle watched Elias through the rear window as the distance between them opened. He was standing on the sidewalk in his brown canvas jacket, with his hands in his pockets, watching the car go. He wasn't looking at her window specifically. He was just watching the way people do when they're making sure something arrived safely. Then he turned and walked away, and the city closed around him. And Brielle faced forward in the dark car and thought about the access logs waiting on a server and the name of a man who sat 3 chairs away from her every Tuesday morning and had apparently been betting, very heavily, on a different version of tonight. That bet had failed, and now the window was closing, and the morning was coming, and she was going to be ready for it. Detective Paulson called at 7:14 the next morning. Brielle was already awake. She'd slept 4 hours in a hotel room that Marcus had booked under a corporate alias, a quiet room on the 9th floor of a place near Pike Place Market that smelled faintly of coffee from the restaurant below, and she'd spent the remaining hours. Before dawn's, sitting at the small desk by the window with her laptop and a legal pad, building the sequence of events into something coherent enough to hand to investigators without losing the details that mattered. She picked up on the first ring. "We recovered a phone," Paulson said, without preamble. One of the men left it on the ground when he ran. It was under a bench near the service road entrance. Our guys found it on the second sweep of the park. A brief pause. "I need you to come in this morning." Earlier than we originally said. "What's on it?" Brielle asked. "Messages. Enough of them, and specific enough, that I want you sitting across from me when I go through them." Another pause. "Bring your lawyer." Brielle looked at the legal pad in front of her. "I'll be there in an hour. Make it 45 minutes, Paulson said, and ended the call. The precinct was a building that looked exactly like what it was functional, underfunded in the cosmetic sense, operating at a pace that was neither urgent nor relaxed, but the specific institutional tempo of a place that dealt with serious things every day and had learned to treat that as normal. Paulson met Brielle in a corridor outside the main detective bullpen, shook her hand once, and led her to a conference room that had a whiteboard on one wall and a folding table that had seen better decades. Brielle's attorney, a sharp woman named Claudia Reyes, who had been with her since North Star's 3rd year, was already there. Seated with a yellow legal pad and the expression of someone who had been briefed by phone at 6 in the morning and was professionally unhappy about it, but professionally prepared regardless. Paulson set a tablet on the table, not Brielle's, a department device, and turned it so they could see the screen. "The phone belonged to the man your witness put on the ground in the first 30 seconds, Paulson said. "His name is Jerome Cates. He has 2 prior arrests, no convictions, and apparently not enough sense to use a burner for a job like this." She pulled up a message thread. "These messages go back 11 days. The other number in the thread has been traced to a prepaid device that was purchased with cash in Tacoma 6 weeks ago. That device is almost certainly gone." She looked at Brielle. "But the content of these messages tells us most of what we need to know about the chain of instruction." Brielle read without touching the screen. The messages were not elegant. They were the kind of communications that people produce when they are confident they won't be read by anyone who matters: casual, abbreviated, occasionally impatient. But the content was specific. Thursday night. Hawthorne Park East Path, somewhere between 9:30 and 10:15. Woman carrying company device. Do not damage device. Code is required. If she won't give it, bring the device and she comes with you. And then 3 days later, she carries it in a slim black case inside her bag. The bag is brown leather, structured shoulder strap. She usually keeps the tablet in the outer compartment. Someone had watched her, not just read her calendar, watched her, known what her bag looked like, known how she packed it. Claudia put her hand on Brielle's arm, and Brielle realized she'd been very still for about 15 seconds. "Are you all right?" Claudia asked quietly. "Yes," Brielle said. She meant it, but it took a moment to land. "I'm all right." Paulson was watching her with the particular patience of someone who had delivered difficult information many times and understood that people needed a beat before they could continue. "Access logs I forwarded you last night," Brielle said. "The workstation on the 18th floor. I saw them," Paulson said. "I want to talk about what you know about Dorian Kessler before I tell you what we've been able to put together from our end overnight." Brielle nodded, and she began to talk. She'd started to suspect Dorian approximately 8 weeks earlier, though she hadn't been able to name it clearly until she was further along. It had begun with a discrepancy in a vendor contract, a small one, the kind that could be attributed to administrative error and usually was. Payment that had been routed through a subsidiary account rather than directly, with a processing fee that didn't correspond to any service North Star had contracted for. The amount was not large in the context of the company's overall financials. But Brielle had not built North Star into what it was by ignoring things that didn't add up. She'd asked her internal finance team to run a quiet audit. Not a formal one, not yet. Not until she had something more concrete, but a systematic review of contract payments over the preceding 24 months, cross-referenced against vendor records and bank routing data. What they found over the next 6 weeks was a pattern. Small amounts, consistently, always routed through accounts that had legitimate business purposes on paper subsidiary operations, consulting agreements, vendor relationships that appeared real until you looked at the underlying entities and found that several of them were shells registered in states with minimal disclosure requirements. The total across 24 months was not small. The preliminary estimate was somewhere north of $4 million, with additional transactions still being traced. The audit files on the tablet represented the first 47 pages of that documentation. Not enough to act on, yet there were gaps, transactions that needed further verification, but enough to establish the pattern with sufficient clarity that anyone who understood corporate finance would see exactly what had been happening. Dorian Kessler had been with North Star for 4 years. He had access to every financial system in the company. He had helped design several of them, and he had, as CFO, the authority to approve certain categories of payment without secondary review, a structural trust most companies extend to their senior financial officers, and that Dorian had apparently been exploiting since approximately his 18th month in the role. Paulson listened to all of this without interrupting. When Brielle finished, she looked at her notepad for a moment. "Prepaid device that sent those messages," she said. "We can't prove it was Kessler's. Not from the phone records alone," she looked up. "But we've had a financial crimes investigator working through the night on the access logs you sent. And we've requested North Star's financial records through a preservation order, which means Kessler cannot legally destroy or alter them as of 5:40 this morning." She let that sit. "Problem is the server-side files, the ones your audit team compiled. They're intact," Brielle said. "I verified that last night." "I know. But accessing them for investigative purposes requires your cooperation because of the 3-administrator protocol." Paulson's expression was direct. "I need those files, Ms. Langford. All 47 pages and whatever underlying data your team assembled." "You'll have them," Brielle said. "I'll arrange access within the hour." Claudia made a note. "One more thing," Paulson said. She looked at Brielle steadily. "Kessler came into the office this morning." Brielle felt something tighten in her jaw. "He badged in at 7:52, Paulson said. "He's been at his workstation for about 20 minutes. He doesn't know yet that those files are under a preservation order, and he doesn't know we have Kate's phone." She paused. "I would like very much for things to stay that way for the next 3 hours, while my financial crimes team finishes what they're doing." "I wasn't planning to call him," Brielle said. "I know. But I need you to go about your morning as normally as you can manage. Go to your office. Don't avoid him specifically, but don't seek him out. If he speaks to you, be normal." Paulson looked at her. "I understand that's an uncomfortable ask." "It's a professional ask," Brielle said. "I can manage uncomfortable." She called Elias from the car on the way to North Star. She wasn't entirely sure why. Claudia was in the car with her, working through her own notes on a separate call, and Marcus was driving, and Brielle had 17 things she should have been doing with her phone board members to notify at some point. Her communications team to brief, her executive assistant, who'd been sending increasingly anxious messages since 6 in the morning. She had a full and legitimate list of necessary calls. She called Elias instead. He picked up on the 3rd ring. In the background, she could hear something that sounded like a radio morning traffic report, maybe in the ambient sounds of movement, like he was already doing something with his hands. "It's Brielle Langford," she said. A brief pause. "I know your name," he said. "You gave me your card." "Right." She hadn't slept enough for this. "I wanted to let you know the police found a phone at the park last night. It connects the robbery to someone inside my company. They're moving on it this morning." Okay, his voice was even. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. I wanted you to know because you gave a statement last night, and you should understand how this is developing." She paused. "They may need to talk to you again." "That's fine." "Paulson already called me this morning. I'm going in at 2. She hadn't expected that. She called you? She needs me to walk through the physical confrontation in detail angles, sequence exactly what was said. He sounded unsurprised by all of it. Standard witness protocol. She thought about that. You've done this before. Given statements.
Yes.
Military investigations, a beat of silence sometimes. She looked out the window at the Seattle morning gray and damp, the kind of day that felt like the city was keeping its options open. Detective Paulson told me something when I first spoke to her last night, she said. She said that most witnesses in situations like that can't describe much beyond a general impression. But you gave her compass directions. Elias said nothing. I'm not asking you to explain it, she said. I just wanted you to know that detail, the way you processed everything in real time that's going to be important. The prosecutor is going to need a witness who can give clear sequence testimony about what happened in that park. I can do that, he said simply. I know you can. She paused. How's your face? I put ice on it. Good. You sound like you haven't slept, he said. 4 hours. That's not enough, I'm aware. She almost smiled. Thank you. For last night. For staying and for coming to the building and for she stopped. She had a lot to be grateful for and no clean way to express it. Just thank you. You're going into the office now, he said. Yes. He's there? She didn't ask how he'd pieced that together. Yes. A pause. Keep Marcus close, I will, and call me when it's over, he said. Not as a request exactly. More like a fact he was putting on the table, something that would happen when the time came. I will, she said. She ended the call and looked at her phone for a moment before putting it away. Claudia glanced over at her, eyebrows slightly raised. That was the man from the park, Brielle said. Claudia looked at her for another second. He sounds careful, she said, and went back to her notes. Walking into North Star that morning was one of the stranger experiences of Brielle's professional life, and she had a reasonably long list of strange professional experiences to compare it to. The building looked exactly as it always did. The lobby team greeted her. Her assistant, a 26-year-old named Petra, who had the organizational instincts of someone twice her age and the nervous energy of someone half of it, intercepted her at the elevator with a coffee and a briefing summary, and 4 questions that needed immediate answers. Brielle answered 3 of them and deferred the 4th, took the coffee, and rode up to the 23rd floor with the sensation of moving through a completely normal morning that was happening on top of a completely abnormal one, like 2 transparencies layered on a light table. She sat in her office and worked. She took calls. She signed off on 2 documents. She responded to board member messages with carefully calibrated versions of everything is under control, which was at least partially true and would become more true by the end of the day. At 9:55, her desk phone rang, internal line. She looked at the display, 18th floor. She picked up. Brielle. Dorian Kessler's voice was warm and professionally concerned, the particular tone he used when he wanted to seem collaborative. I heard there was some kind of incident last night. Are you okay? I've been hearing fragments all morning. She had prepared for this. She had decided, in the car, exactly how she would handle it if he reached out before the investigators moved. I'm fine, she said. Someone tried to rob me in Hawthorne Park. It was handled. The police are involved. God, that's awful. Was anything taken? He wanted to know about the tablet. My purse and phone, she said. I'll need to replace a few things. Police have they're working through it, she said, keeping her voice even and administrative. Dorian, I've got a board call in 10 minutes. Can we catch up at the afternoon review? A very brief pause. Of course. I'm glad you're all right. Thanks, she said and ended the call. She sat for a moment with her hand on the phone. Then she took it away and went back to her emails because Paulson had asked her to be normal and normal meant working, and she was genuinely very good at working, regardless of what else was happening around her. Call from Paulson came at 11:43. We're moving in 20 minutes, Paulson said. I need you to step out of your office and go to the conference room on your floor. Take your general counsel and your head of HR. Don't stop at the elevator bank, my people are using it. Understood. Do not go to the 18th floor under any circumstances. I know, Ms. Langford. Paulson's voice was steady. We have enough. The financial crimes team finished the trace an hour ago. Kessler routed money through 7 shell entities across 3 states. The total is closer to $6 million than 4. And the messages on Kate's phone, we found the connecting number on a second device that was recovered from one of the other men this morning. It's a chain, she paused. It's enough. Brielle stood at her office window and looked out at the city below. The gray morning had not lifted, the streets were wet, and the cars moved in their usual patterns, and the world was proceeding with complete indifference to the fact that in 20 minutes, chief financial officer of a company she had spent her adult life building was going to be arrested at his own desk. Thank you, she said. You did the hard part, Paulson said. You built the audit trail. We followed it. A brief pause, and then, this is going to become public very quickly once it moves. Do you have a communications team ready? I'm calling them now. Good luck, Paulson said and ended the call. The next 2 hours were organized chaos, which was, Brielle had come to believe, the only kind of chaos worth engaging with. Unorganized chaos was just damage. Organized chaos had structure underneath it, even when it was hard to see. She got her general counsel and HR director into the 23rd floor conference room within 4 minutes. Her communications director joined by phone 60 seconds later. She briefed them in 10 minutes flat, not everything, not the full depth of what she'd been building over the past 6 weeks, but enough. Enough to prepare statements, enough to anticipate the questions that were coming, enough for each person in the room to understand their specific role in what was about to happen. Through the conference room's glass wall, she could see the elevator bank at the far end of the corridor. At 11:58, the doors opened, and 4 people stepped out, 2 plainclothes investigators she recognized from the night before, 2 uniformed officers. They walked past without looking at the conference room and turned toward the stairwell that led down to 18. Nobody in the conference room said anything for a moment. Then Brielle's communications director asked a question about media timing, and Brielle answered it, and they kept working. She learned afterward from Paulson, who called at 2:15 with a debrief, that Dorian had not gone quietly. He had not created a physical scene, but he had spent approximately 40 minutes in a conference room on the 18th floor with his own attorney, speaking in circles, before he apparently decided the situation was more contained than it was, and tried to present an alternative account of the shell companies that fell apart within 10 minutes under questioning because the financial crimes investigator had spent 8 hours building a forensic map of every transaction and could identify specific inconsistencies in real time. He'd been arrested at 12:47. Kate's and 2 of the other men from the park had been formally charged that morning. The remaining 2 were in the process of being identified through the physical evidence recovered from the scene. There'll be a bail hearing tomorrow, Paulson told her. Given the amount and the nature of the conspiracy charge, I'm going to request remand, but I can't promise how it'll go. You should be prepared for the possibility that he's out on bail while this moves through the system. I understand, Brielle said. His lawyer is already talking about a cooperation deal, which is complicated. I want you to be aware that if they reach an agreement, some of what comes out in that process will be hard to control in terms of public narrative. I'd rather have the full truth on record than a controlled story, Brielle said. Whatever comes out, comes out. Paulson made a sound that was not quite agreement, but was close to respect. I'll keep you informed, Detective. Brielle paused. The witness from the park, Elias Mercer. He came in to see you this afternoon? He did. He's clear, thorough, and he doesn't editorialize. A brief pause. He's going to be a very good witness. I thought he might be, Brielle said. She ended the call and sat in her office for a few minutes in genuine quiet, not the performed quiet of someone trying to appear calm, but the real kind that comes when something that has been building for a long time has finally broken open. She thought about the audit files, 47 pages that had been the target of a coordinated theft attempt. Now those pages were the foundation of a federal investigation, and the man who had wanted them destroyed had spent the morning in a conference room watching his own story come apart piece by piece. She thought about $6 million, moved slowly and carefully over 4 years, from accounts that were supposed to pay vendors and support operations, and help build the infrastructure of a company that made medical technology that, at its best, made things that actually helped people. Redirected, a few thousand at a time, into shell accounts that existed for no purpose other than to funnel money to a man who sat at executive meetings and talked about fiscal responsibility. She was tired, she was angry. And underneath both of those, She was something else, not relief, exactly, but the feeling of something being corrected, of the record being set straight. Called Elias at 4:30. He answered after 2 rings. She could hear, in the background, the distinct sound of a 9-year-old explaining something at some length, and then a door, and then quiet. "Sorry," he said. "She's working on a science project. The topic is volcanoes, and her current position is that all other science project topics are inferior." Brielle laughed. It surprised her. She hadn't expected to laugh today, and she certainly hadn't expected it to feel that easy. "It's done," she said. "He was arrested at 12:47. Pause. Good. The financial crimes team traced about $6 million across 7 shell entities." She stopped. "Keep saying that number, and it still doesn't feel real." "Numbers like that never do," Elias said. "Until they do." She looked at her window. The city outside had gotten darker in the late afternoon, and the streetlights were beginning to take over. "I wanted you to know. You were part of why this happened. If those men had gotten the tablet, or if you hadn't stayed, hadn't come with me to the building, the window might have closed. The window would have opened again," he said. "You would have found another way. Maybe, but this way was faster, and that mattered." She paused. "Paulson said you were a good witness. She asked good questions. She also told me you gave her compass directions for the park confrontation." "Quiet beat, force of habit, Elias." She said his name carefully. "Can I ask you something? You don't have to answer it." "Go ahead. Last night, when you folded your jacket and put it on the bench before you walked toward those men." She paused. "Why did you do that?" "The folding." He was quiet for a moment. She wasn't sure he was going to answer. "I used to do it before operations," he said finally. "Leave things in order." In case he stopped. It was just a habit. "I didn't think about it." "In case you didn't come back," she said quietly. He didn't confirm it. He didn't have to. "You have a daughter," she said. "You went in anyway." "She was safe," he said. "You weren't." The simplicity of it was almost difficult to absorb. Not because it was complex, but because it was so completely without performance. He had done a calculation, decided it was the right one, and acted on it. He wasn't telling her it was heroic. He was telling her it was math. "I want to do something," she said, "to acknowledge what you did. And before you tell me, you don't need it. I don't need." "I know," she said. "I know you don't need it, but I need to do it. There's a difference." She let that sit for a moment. "The Garfield Community Center, where you were working last night. I've been doing maintenance there for 2 years. I know. I had my assistant pull their public records this morning." She paused. "They applied for a community safety program grant 8 months ago and were turned down on the second review because their application documentation was insufficient. The program would have allowed them to expand their evening programming and add certified safety training for staff and neighborhood volunteers." She waited. "I'd like to fund it. Through the North Star Foundation, it's arm's length from the company, fully independent. No strings, a silence. That's not a reward for last night," she continued. "The center exists regardless of what happened. The program is worth funding regardless of whether I've ever set foot in Hawthorne Park." She paused. "But I'm in a position to make it happen, and you're in a position to help design it in a way that actually works, because you've been volunteering there long enough to know what the gaps are. I'm asking if you're interested in that." Another silence. "Longer. That's a careful way to offer something," he said. "I've been told I'm a careful person. And if I say no?" "The center still gets the funding," she said. "The offer to involve you in the design is separate." He exhaled slowly. She could almost hear him working through it the way she'd come to recognize he processed things, systematically, without hurry. "I'd have to think about it," he said. "That's a reasonable answer. And I'd have to run it by some people at the center." Also reasonable. "And Sadie would have opinions," he said, with a very dry delivery. "I look forward to hearing them," Brielle said. This time she heard the smile, even through the phone. He didn't suppress it in time. "I'll think about it," he said again. "Take your time," she said. They said goodbye, and she set her phones on the desk, and for the first time all day she sat back in her chair without any particular urgency pulling her toward the next thing. Outside, Seattle was settling into its evening, the lights coming on in the buildings across the street, the traffic below moving in its usual patterns. The city carrying on with the comprehensive indifference that cities maintain toward the specific dramas of specific people inside them. Inside her office, Brielle was thinking about a man who had folded his jacket before walking into something dangerous because that's what he'd always done. Not for her, not for anyone watching. Just because it was the habit of a person who had always prepared for the possibility that things might not go the way he hoped and had gone in anyway. She was also thinking, with some surprise, the thing she felt right now in the wake of a crisis she'd been managing for 6 weeks and a confrontation she'd been building toward for the last 18 hours was not satisfaction at the outcome. Exactly. It was more specific than that. It was the feeling of having been seen clearly by someone who had no reason to look in a moment when she had not been performing anything. In the park, behind the fountain. When she'd looked at him and asked who he was and he'd said, simply someone who called the police before he walked over here. She hadn't known then that the man standing at the edge of the lamplight had once operated in places she'd never heard of, had extracted people from situations that didn't have good options, had come home from all of that and decided the most important thing left to do was make sure a 9-year-old girl didn't grow up without her father. She hadn't known any of that, and somehow in the way he'd moved through the park and put her behind cover and waited with her for the sirens, somehow she'd sensed the outline of it anyway. She had been running a company since she was 28 years old, and she was good at reading the people around her. She was particularly good at identifying what people wanted from her, because people generally wanted something her time, her endorsement, her proximity, her money. She'd grown so accustomed to that calculation that she'd stopped expecting anything different. Elias Mercer had wanted nothing from her. He had wanted her to be safe because that was the correct outcome, and he was a person who organized himself around correct outcomes. And when it was over, he had sat on a bench with a cut on his face and a thermos of cold coffee and waited until she didn't need him anymore, and then he'd stood up and asked if she had a phone call to make. That was it. She was still thinking about that when her assistant knocked on the door to hand her the afternoon briefing, and she came back to the present and picked up the papers and went back to being the person who ran this place. Kept coming back to it, in the spaces between things. The jacket on the bench, the way he'd folded it like he was leaving something in order. The completely ordinary gesture of a man preparing for something that was anything but ordinary. In a park on a cold October night, while the city went about its business, and a 9-year-old girl waited 3 blocks away in her grandmother's apartment, safe and completely unaware of how close the evening had come to becoming a different kind of story. The story broke on a Friday. By Saturday morning, it was on 3 national news platforms, and by Sunday, it had been picked up by a financial journalism outlet that ran a 1,200-word piece under the headline Northstar CFO, arrested in multi-year fraud scheme CEO, acted swiftly to preserve evidence. Piece was reasonably accurate, which Brielle found mildly surprising, and it focused primarily on the financial mechanics of what Dorian had built the shell entities, the routing structure, the 4-year timeline rather than on the robbery, which was covered in a single paragraph near the bottom as context for how the investigation had accelerated. She had hoped the park incident would stay peripheral to the story. That hope lasted approximately 48 hours. By Monday, 2 local television stations had identified Elias from police records that were technically public, and one of them had sent a camera crew to the Garfield Community Center asking questions. The center's director, a steady woman named Ruth Ibarra, who had been running the place for 11 years and had seen enough to know when a camera crew needed to be redirected, told them she had no comment on behalf of anyone, offered them coffee, and called Elias from her office while they waited in the lobby. Elias declined every interview request. He did it politely and without explanation, which apparently made the story more interesting to the people asking. By Wednesday, a morning radio program had run a segment calling him a mystery guardian and a reluctant hero, which he found mortifying in the specific way that people who have done genuinely difficult things find being described in those terms. Brielle heard about the radio segment from Petra, who had been monitoring media coverage since the story broke and had the slightly wired energy of someone doing a job they found genuinely interesting. He's declined 4 interview requests as of this morning, Petra said. 2 television, 1 print, 1 podcast. I know, Brielle said. The podcast one was pretty big, like nationally syndicated. I know, Petra. I'm just saying most people would have. He's not most people. Brielle said, and Petra, who was perceptive enough to recognize a closed subject, moved on to the next item. The formal reward offer came from North Star's board. It had not been Brielle's idea, though she hadn't opposed it. The board had convened an emergency session the previous week to assess the company's exposure from the Kessler situation, and at the end of that session, the chairman had raised the question of the witness in the park. Several board members had opinions about optics and gratitude and the value of public narrative in a moment when the company needed good press. They'd settled on a number that Brielle thought reflected their instinct for generosity and their complete unfamiliarity with what actually motivated people like Elias Mercer. She delivered the offer herself. She decided that was the right thing, not a letter, not a representative, not a phone call from someone in the legal department. She went to the community center on a Wednesday afternoon in November, 3 weeks after the arrest, because she'd heard from Ruth that Elias would be there doing a scheduled maintenance check on the building's HVAC system. She found him in the basement, standing on a stepladder with a panel open above him, doing something methodical with a set of filters that needed replacing. He heard her on the stairs and looked down. "You could have called," he said. "I was in the neighborhood." He looked at her with an expression that made it clear he did not believe she happened to be in the neighborhood. Came down from the ladder, pulled a rag from his back pocket, and wiped his hands. "The board voted to offer you a financial reward," she said. "Substantial. Enough too," she paused, because she was watching his face, and she already knew how this was going to go. "Enough to change what your life looks like. Significantly." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the filters he'd set down on a workbench. "How much?" she told him. He was quiet for a beat. Not impressed quiet or tempted quiet, just processing quiet. "No," he said. "Elias, no." He said it without heat. "I walked across a park. That's not worth what you just said." "The board disagrees." The board wasn't there. He picked up the filters again. "I don't want it." She had prepared for this. "Can I ask why?" Specifically. Turned and looked at her. He seemed to consider whether to answer with something brief and final, and then decided against it. "Sadie doesn't need a rich father," he said. "She needs her father." Those are different things. He looked back at the HVAC panel. Money like that changes the shape of things. It changes what people think of you, what they expect from you, how they relate to you. "I've worked very hard to keep my life a particular shape. I don't want to blow it up." Brielle absorbed that. "You sound like someone who's thought about this before." "I have." He said it without elaboration. "The money would give you options. Security. You wouldn't have to." She gestured at the basement around them, not dismissively, just factually. "I like this job," he said. "I like the center. I like Ruth. I like knowing what my day looks like." He paused. "I know that sounds small to someone who runs a company with 400 employees." "Doesn't," she said, and she meant it. He looked at her. "I run a company with 400 employees," she said, "and I cannot tell you with any certainty what my day looks like on any given morning. That's not a trade I'd recommend to everyone." She paused. "I'm not going to push the reward, but I want you to know the offer stands, indefinitely, if you ever change your mind." He nodded once. That subject was apparently closed. "Community program," he said, "the one you mentioned on the phone." "The North Star Foundation approved the grant last week," she said. "Ruth has the documentation. It covers the full program: evening safety training, staff certification, expanded community response resources. 18 months of funding with a review for continuation." Something moved across his expression. Not quite surprise, he'd known it was coming, but something that looked like genuine response, the kind people produce when something they care about is treated with actual seriousness. "I talked to Ruth about the design," he said, "about what the program should actually cover, based on what I've seen here. I know. She sent me 12 pages of notes. I told her 8 would be enough." Apparently she disagreed. The corner of his mouth moved. "Yeah, she usually does." Brielle smiled. It was the first time she realized that they'd had an exchange that felt like something other than a crisis being managed or an obligation being discharged. It felt like two people who found each other faintly amusing, which was a different thing entirely. "I'm glad you're involved," she said, "in the program design. Ruth told me you've been thinking about the structure for a long time. 2 years, roughly. Since I noticed the gaps." He leaned against the workbench. "The center gets a lot of use from families in this neighborhood. Evening hours, mostly. But the staff aren't trained for the situations that come up, sometimes not in any systematic way. Someone shows up in distress. There's a conflict in the parking lot. Things that aren't emergencies but need someone who knows what they're doing. He paused. I've been filling those gaps informally because I'm here and I have the background. But informal doesn't scale. Informal stops the moment I'm not around. You want to build something that works without you, Brielle said. He looked at her. That's the only kind of thing worth building. She thought about her company, about the systems she'd spent 3 years putting in place, not because she planned to leave, but because she understood that an organization that depended entirely on its founder's presence was not an organization, it was a person wearing an organization's clothes. I know what you mean, she said. He seemed to register that she did. They stood for a moment in the low-ceilinged basement with the hum of the mechanical systems around them, and it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens between people who have said enough for the moment and don't feel compelled to fill the space. Can I ask you something? Elias said. Yes, the media coverage. The TV stations that came to the center. He looked at her. Did North Star have anything to do with that, in terms of directing them here? She held his gaze. No. Your name is in the police report, which is a public document. They found it themselves. He nodded slowly. I believe you. But, she said, because there was clearly a but. But someone in that chain of coverage, the radio segment, the national pickup that moved faster than public records alone usually move. He was not accusing her. He was observing. Someone with PR resources gave it a push at some point. She thought about it honestly. My communications director shaped the narrative around the arrest. She emphasized the evidence preservation angle and the speed of the response. It's possible that in doing that, she made the story interesting enough that the human interest angle you became more findable. She paused. I didn't instruct her to do that, but I also didn't tell her not to. He looked at her for a long moment. That's an honest answer, he said. I try to give those, even when they're uncomfortable, especially then. She met his eyes. I'm sorry if the coverage caused problems for you. I should have anticipated it, and I didn't. It didn't cause problems, he said. It just annoyed me. There's a difference. He straightened. Sadie thought it was funny. She told her class her dad was on the radio. Brielle felt something warm move through her chest. What did her class think? They wanted to know if I was famous. He said it with the dry resignation of a man who had been asked a version of this question several times by 9-year-olds. I told them no. They were skeptical. You might need to revise your position on that. I'm not famous, he said flatly. I'm a maintenance worker who was in the wrong park at the right time. That's one way to frame it. It's the accurate way. She looked at him, Elias. You broke a man's wrist in 3 seconds and then moved me behind a stone fountain in a way that gave you a clear line of sight to every approach angle while simultaneously providing me with cover from 2 directions simultaneously. That is not a skill set that belongs to someone who was simply in the wrong park. He blinked. You notice the angles? I notice things, she said. It's what I do. Something shifted in his expression, not discomfort this time, but something closer to recognition. The look of someone who has been seen accurately after a long time of being seen approximately. He picked up the filters and turned back to the ladder. I should finish this. Of course, she said. I'll let you work. She started toward the stairs, and then he said, without turning around, the program review. After 18 months, Ruth said you'd be involved in the assessment. Yes. Will you come here for it? Or is it a document review? I'll come here, she said. I don't like document-only reviews. You can't read a room from a summary. He was halfway up the ladder. Good, he said, and that was all. She went back up the stairs and out through the center's main corridor, where 2 teenagers were playing a loud game of something at a table near the window, and Ruth was on the phone in her office with the door half open. The place smelled like industrial cleaning fluid and old carpet, and, faintly, someone's microwave lunch from earlier in the day. It was not by any measure a glamorous environment. And she drove back to North Star thinking about the man in the basement who had spent 2 years quietly filling gaps in a community center's capacity and thinking about how to build something that would outlast his own presence there. The friendship developed the way real ones do sideways, and without anyone deciding it was happening. It began with the program. Elias was involved in the design work, and Brielle was on the Foundation's oversight committee, and there were meetings. Not many. Ruth was efficient, and Elias was concise, and Brielle had learned long ago that meetings expanded to fill whatever time was allotted them, unless someone in the room declined to let that happen. But there were enough meetings that she started to know the specific texture of how he thought, which was methodical and lateral. At the same time, he'd go through a problem sequentially, and then step back and ask a structural question that reframed the whole thing. In December, Sadie's school had a parent volunteer day, and Elias couldn't attend because he had a job that couldn't be rescheduled, and Ruth had an administrative conflict. And somehow through a chain of events that Brielle later found difficult to reconstruct exactly. It ended up being Brielle who showed up at Garfield Elementary at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning to help a class of 9-year-olds do a science activity involving baking soda and vinegar. She spent 2 hours watching volcanoes erupt in plastic cups and answering questions from a small girl with her father's dark eyes and her own very particular conversational style, which involved asking follow-up questions until she received an answer she found satisfactory. "Do you work with my dad?" Sadie asked. "In a way," Brielle said. "What way?" "We're working on a project together at the community center." Sadie considered this. "He likes the community center. He says it's important to take care of your neighborhood." "He's right. He says that about a lot of things." She looked up. "He said you were smart." Brielle paused in the middle of refilling a vinegar bottle. "Did he?" "He said you figured things out fast." Sadie tilted her head. "He doesn't say that about many people. Usually he just says people are fine." "Just fine?" "He's not mean about it. He just thinks most people aren't paying attention." She watched her volcano with professional interest. "Pays attention to everything. It's kind of a lot sometimes." Brielle thought about compass directions given to a detective at 10:30 at night. "I imagine it is," she said. "Are you his friend?" Sadie asked. The directness of 9-year-olds was something nobody fully prepared you for. "I think so," Brielle said. "I hope so." Sadie appeared to weigh this answer against some internal standard. "Okay," she said, apparently satisfied, and pushed her volcano toward the cup of vinegar. She told Elias about the exchange that evening, when he called to thank her for covering the volunteer slot. There was a pause on his end that went on slightly longer than usual. She said, "I think people are just fine," he said. Her words. Another pause. I don't think that. I believe you. I think most people are," he stopped. "I think most people are managing something. They're just not always paying attention to the right things." "That's a kinder framing than just fine," Brielle said. "She's 9. Her framings are efficient." Brielle laughed, and it happened easily, the way it had been happening more often in recent weeks when she talked to him. There was something about the way he engaged with the world directly, without cushioning things that didn't need cushioning, with a completely undisguised affection for his daughter that made her feel like she didn't have to manage her own words very carefully. She could just say things, and they would land where they landed. That was rarer than it should have been. "She told me you said I was smart," Brielle said. A very brief silence. "I said you figured things out quickly." "That's the same thing." "It's a more specific thing," he said. "Smart is a general category. Figuring things out quickly under pressure is a particular skill." "They're not the same." She thought about that. "Fair point." "She also told you I said it," he said, "which I did not expect her to do." "She's 9. Editing is not her strong suit." "Apparently not." He didn't sound annoyed. He sounded like a man who was very used to being surprised by the specific person his daughter was becoming, and had decided to find it more interesting than alarming. "Thank you for today," he said. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to." She meant it. "She's remarkable, Elias. You should know that." Another pause. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm aware." There was something in those 3 words that she didn't push on. Just acknowledged. The way you acknowledge things that are large enough that adding words to them only diminishes them. In January, he fixed her car. She had not asked him to. She had mentioned, in passing, during a meeting at the center, that her car had been making a sound that her mechanic had described in terms she found unconvincing and had proposed addressing with a repair that seemed disproportionately expensive. Elias had asked what kind of sound. She'd demonstrated badly. She was the first to admit, and he'd said it was probably the heat shield on the catalytic converter, and it was a $40 fix, not a $400 one. She'd looked at him. "How do you know that?" "I restore cars," he said. "On weekends, when Sadie lets me." He said it the way people describe hobbies they are deeply serious about, but have learned not to lead with, because people who don't share the interest tend to glaze over. The sound you made that particular rattle at cold start, it's almost always the heat shield. She'd driven the car to his house on a Saturday morning. He'd been in the driveway when she arrived, under a partially restored 1968 Ford that was in a state of dignified disassembly, and Sadie had been sitting on the back steps with a book and a bowl of cereal, reading with the focused inattention of someone who was definitely aware of what was happening around her and had decided it was beneath her notice. He fixed the car in 20 minutes. He did not charge her. She stood in the driveway afterward with her keys in her hand, feeling the specific discomfort of someone who has very few frameworks for receiving something without being able to give something equivalent in return. I could at least, she started. No, he said. He was wiping his hands on a rag, not looking at her. It took 20 minutes, Elias. You spent 2 hours helping Sadie's class make volcanoes, he said. We're even. She looked at him. Probably, he added, which was as close as he came to humor. She stayed for an hour and a half. Not because she'd planned to, but because Sadie came down from the steps to show her the book she was reading, a mystery novel that was apparently well above her grade level, which Sadie was aware of and considered a point of personal pride, and then to ask Brielle several detailed questions about what it was like to run a company, which Brielle answered honestly and without simplifying, because she'd learned in the volunteer day that Sadie found simplification condescending and was not shy about indicating this. Elias made coffee. The kitchen was functional and not particularly tidy. There was a drawing Sadie had made pinned to the refrigerator alongside a school schedule and 2 takeout menus and a reminder about a dentist. Appointment written in Elias's handwriting on a sticky note. On the counter there was a coffee maker that had seen extensive use and a half-empty bag of beans and a bowl of fruit in which one apple was doing significantly better than the others. It was the kitchen of a single father who was doing his best and not always catching every detail, and it was, in its way, the most human space Brielle had been in for longer than she could easily calculate. She drove home that afternoon thinking that she had eaten breakfast in hotel restaurants and business lunches in places with dress codes and dinners at events where the food was secondary to the purpose of being seen at the event. She could not immediately identify the last time she'd drunk coffee in someone's actual kitchen on a Saturday morning while a 9-year-old explained the plot of a mystery novel. She thought about what Elias had said in the community center basement. She needs her father, not a rich father, her father. She understood it differently now, not as a rejection of wealth or a principled stance or a statement about values, though it was all of those things, but as something more specific and harder to articulate. The understanding that the texture of an ordinary day, the sticky note on the counter, the coffee maker, the fruit bowl, was the actual substance of what Sadie would remember when she was 30. Not events, not milestones, the specific ordinary accumulation of being present. Elias had given up something significant to provide that, and he'd done it so completely that it no longer read as sacrifice. It just read as his life. February brought the first of the trial proceedings. Dorian's attorney had floated the cooperation deal, and Paulson had been right that it complicated the narrative. There was a period of about 3 weeks where various fragments of what Dorian was offering the prosecution appeared in media coverage in ways that were selective and not entirely accurate. His legal team was clearly trying to manage his public image alongside the legal strategy, which was their prerogative, and which Brielle found professionally frustrating but legally unremarkable. She gave one media interview to the financial journalism outlet that had covered the arrest most accurately. She did it on her terms, written questions, 24 hours to review before publication. No photos beyond the company headshot she already had on file. She described the audit process, the evidence preservation decision, and the importance of immediate disclosure when fraud is discovered inside a company. She did not discuss the park. She did not mention Elias. He read the piece and called her. You kept me out of it, he said. You asked me to. I didn't specifically. You asked me when we were standing outside North Star that first night, not to announce your arrival. She paused. I extrapolated. A beat. That was 3 months ago. I have a good memory. He was quiet for a moment. Thank you, he said. And then, after a brief pause, the piece was good. You said exactly what needed to be said. I had a lot of practice saying it by then. part about immediate disclosure about transparency being a structural choice, not a reactive one. He paused. That's the right framing. Most organizations treat disclosure as a last resort. You treated it as a first principle. She looked at her office window. It was raining in the particular Seattle way, not dramatic, just persistent. Someone told me once that the only kind of thing worth building is something that works without you, she said. I've been thinking about that in relation to a lot of things, including how a company should handle its own problems. A brief silence. I said that about the community program. I know where you said it. You're applying it to corporate governance. I'm applying it everywhere, she said. It's a good principle. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. I'll send you a bill, he said. Put it toward the program, she said, and this time it was clearly a smile, on both ends of the line. It was Marcus who said it out loud first, which surprised her, because Marcus was not given to personal observations about Brielle's life. He had worked for her for 2 years and change, and he was professional and effective and had never once, in her memory, commented on anything outside the strict parameters of her physical security. It was a Thursday in March. She was in the car after a long board meeting, heading back toward the office, and she'd been on her phone with Elias for about 12 minutes discussing the community program's first quarterly review, and when she finally hung up, Marcus said, from the front seat without preamble, "He's good for you." She looked up. "Excuse me?" Just an observation," Marcus said, in the tone of someone who is aware they've stepped outside their lane and is doing it deliberately anyway. She looked at the back of his head. "That's outside your job description." "Yes, ma'am." A pause. "You've never said anything like that before." "No, ma'am." She looked out the window. The rain had stopped, and the city was doing the thing it did after rain, where the light came in at angles that made everything look briefly like it was from somewhere else. "He won't make it easy," she said, mostly to herself. "No," Marcus agreed. "He won't." She looked at him in the rearview mirror. He met her eyes for a fraction of a second, and then he looked back at the road. She did not respond, but she thought about it for the rest of the day. Not anxiously, not with the particular brand of calculation she applied to business decisions. Just quietly, the way you think about things when you're not trying to reach a conclusion, but simply following a thought to see where it leads. She thought about a man who had declined a substantial financial reward because he understood the difference between giving his daughter money and giving his daughter himself, who fixed cars on weekends and couldn't always keep the fruit bowl fully replenished, who gave compass directions to police detectives and got annoyed by radio segments and told her, with complete sincerity, that he'd put ice on his face because she'd told him to, who had looked at her on a park bench at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night with blood on his face, not like a CEO or a target or an obligation or an opportunity, just like a person who'd had a hard night and was probably tired and needed to make sure someone was going to walk with her until she didn't need walking with anymore. She had been running since she was 19 years old, running toward the next thing, the next goal, the next stage of what she was trying to build. She was good at it. She had the company and the track record and the empty apartment with the good views to show for it. She was 31 years old, and she had worked very hard, and she was, in a way she rarely examined directly, profoundly tired of only having herself in the frame. That evening, she called Elias to ask if Sadie still liked the mystery novels, or if she'd moved on to something else because she'd seen one in a bookshop window that seemed like it might be right for her. He paused. "Why?" "Because I thought she might like it," Brielle said. "Is that a complicated reason? A beat?" "No," he said. She moved on to historical fiction. Mysteries are apparently for younger readers. She said that last week, with some authority. What kind of historical fiction? Anything set more than 100 years ago, apparently. The older the better. He paused. She told me last night that the Victorian era was more interesting than the present day. She might be right, Brielle said. Don't tell her that, he said. She already has opinions. She laughed again easily, in the way she had stopped being surprised, by the way laughter came out of her when she talked to him, as though her body had decided this was a safe place to do that and was taking advantage of it. I won't, she said, but I'll find her something good. She did. She found 3 books and sent them to the center with a note for Ruth to pass along. because she didn't have Elias's home address and she wasn't ready to ask for it yet. Not because she didn't want to, but because she understood, in the way she understood a few things about him by now, that with Elias Mercer, you did not move faster than the thing could hold. You built carefully. You showed up when you said you would. You didn't make promises you weren't prepared to keep. And you waited, because some things were worth the wait. The books arrived on a Tuesday. That Thursday, Sadie apparently read the first 40 pages of one of them before dinner and pronounced it acceptable, which Ruth reported to Brielle via email with 3 exclamation marks, because Ruth understood that acceptable from Sadie was a standing ovation from anyone else. Elias texted, not called, texted, which he almost never did a single line. She finished it in 2 days. Says you have good taste. High praise. Brielle read it 3 times. Then she put her phone face down on her desk and went back to work, smiling in a way she didn't try to suppress and didn't try to analyze and simply let exist, because some things were better experienced than examined. Outside her window, Seattle was having one of those rare, clear March days where you could see all the way to the mountains, and the light on the water in the distance was the kind of light that made the city look like it had decided, just for an afternoon, to be its best possible version of itself. Spring came to Seattle the way it always did, reluctantly, in increments, with long stretches of gray between the good days that made the good days feel earned rather than given. By April, the Garfield Community Center's safety program had completed its first full training cycle. 12 staff members certified, 2 neighborhood volunteers who'd come in skeptically and stayed because the curriculum was practical rather than theoretical. Incident response protocol that Ruth had laminated and posted in 4 locations throughout the building, because Ruth believed in lamination the way other people believed in backup plans. The program wasn't perfect. Nothing built from scratch ever is, and Elias was the first to identify the gaps when the quarterly review came around. Sitting across from Brielle and the Foundation's oversight representative at the center's conference table, with a list of specific recommendations that he'd clearly been working on for weeks. The evening staffing window between 7 and 9 is still inconsistent, he said. Protocol covers it on paper, but 2 of the 3 staff members trained for that shift have variable schedules. When they're not here, the coverage falls to whoever's available, which defeats the purpose of the certification. The Foundation representative, a careful man named Greg, who had been reviewing grant programs for 15 years, made a note. Is that a staffing funding issue or a scheduling structure issue? Both, Elias said, partly. But mostly it's a retention issue. The 2 certified staff members are part-time. If the center could offer consistent hours, that's in the year 2 proposal, Brielle said. Elias looked at her. I read ahead, she said. Ruth, at the far end of the table, looked like she was suppressing something. Greg made another note. The meeting continued for 40 minutes, and at the end of it he shook hands with everyone and said the Foundation would have a written response to the year 2 proposal within 3 weeks, and he left. Ruth excused herself to take a phone call that had been waiting, which left Elias and Brielle at the conference table with the remains of a coffee service that Ruth had set with the optimism of someone who believed in the civilizing effect of a hot beverage at 10 in the morning. You read the year 2 proposal, Elias said. I told you I would be involved in the assessment. Proposal was submitted last week. I know when it was submitted, she said. Greg got his copy the same day I got mine. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to think of as his recalibrating face when he'd assumed something and the evidence was suggesting otherwise. You're not usually ahead of the documentation. I'm always ahead of the documentation, she said. I just don't usually tell people that because it makes meetings inefficient when everyone knows you've already formed opinions. She picked up her coffee. With you, I don't bother performing the process. He was quiet for a moment. Why not? She looked at him directly, because you'd notice. He held her gaze for a second, and then he looked at the table, and she could see the slight adjustment in his jaw that meant he was deciding not to say something. The retention piece is solvable, she said, returning to practical ground, because she'd learned that Elias responded to practical ground the way some people responded to open air. The year 2 budget includes a reclassification of 2 part-time positions to 3/4 time. It's not full-time, but it stabilizes the scheduling. I know, he said. I wrote it. I know you wrote it. I'm telling you it's going to be approved. He looked up. You don't know that yet. Greg has approved every well-structured proposal that's come across his desk in the last 4 years, she said. I checked. Your proposal is extremely well-structured. She paused. You're going to get your staffing window covered. He looked at her for a long moment. Not suspiciously, she'd passed whatever threshold he used for that a while ago. Just steadily, the way he looked at things he was still finding the edges of. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me. Thank the 12 pages of notes Ruth sent in November. I told her 8 would be enough. She was right and you were wrong, Brielle said. Write that down somewhere. Something in his expression shifted the almost smile, which she had by now catalogued extensively. He reached for his coffee. You're in a good mood, he said. She thought about it. I think I am. That's unusual for a quarterly review morning. Usually, yes. She looked at her cup. The Kessler sentencing was finalized yesterday. Paulson called me last night. He set his cup down. How long? 7 years. His cooperation deal reduced the original recommendation significantly. She paused. His attorneys argued that the cooperation was substantial and early and prevented the investigation from stalling. The judge agreed with part of that. She looked at the window. The full amount was also traced and attached to a restitution order. All $6 million and change. The shell entities are being unwound. That's the right outcome, Elias said. It is. She paused. It doesn't feel entirely satisfying. I thought it would. He looked at her. It rarely does. You sound like someone who knows that from experience. Operations don't feel satisfying when they're over, he said. You feel the adrenaline drop, and then you feel tired, and then you think about everything that could have gone differently. He paused. The satisfaction, if it comes later, when you can see what the outcome actually made possible. She thought about that. What did it make possible? For North Star. Tell me, she considered. We restructured the entire financial oversight protocol. Secondary review requirements on all vendor payments above a threshold. Rotating audit responsibility so no single person has uninterrupted access to the same systems for more than 18 months. She paused. We also created an anonymous internal reporting channel for financial irregularities. Genuinely anonymous, routed through an external firm, no internal access to the intake process. How many reports in the first quarter? 4. 2 were duplicates of the same issue. 1 was resolved administratively. 1 is still under review. She looked at him. Point is, people used it. They trusted it enough to use it. That's the outcome, he said. That's what the 7 years made possible. She looked at him for a moment. You're very good at reframing things. I had a lot of practice. She didn't ask what that meant specifically. She'd learned, with Elias, that some things he'd say when he was ready and not before, and the way to get there was not to push but to stay, to keep showing up consistently enough that the space between them became a place he trusted, and things could be said there that wouldn't have been said in a different space. She was patient. She was, when it mattered, genuinely patient. It was not a quality people associated with her in a professional context, but it was real, and he had begun to see it. The conversation that changed things happened in May, on a Saturday evening, in his driveway. She had come to pick up Sadie. They'd started a monthly arrangement, loosely structured, where Brielle took Sadie to a bookshop, and they spent an hour discussing what Sadie was reading and selecting what she'd read next, which had been Sadie's idea and which Brielle had agreed to with a speed that surprised her. Elias had been repairing a neighbor's truck as a favor, and he'd miscalculated the time, and Sadie had met Brielle at the door and told her with 9-year-old directness that her dad was still in the driveway, and they should go tell him they were leaving. They'd gone to the driveway, and Sadie had made the announcement, and then she'd gone back inside to get her jacket, and Brielle had stayed. Elias was wiping down a socket wrench set with the methodical attention of someone who believed that how you put things away mattered as much as how you used them. He had grease on his forearm, and his hair was slightly less organized than usual, and he looked, in the particular light of a Pacific Northwest May evening, that long, golden, slightly unreal light, like a man who was entirely and uncomplicatedly himself. She's been talking about the bookshop since Tuesday, he said, without looking up. She sent me a list, Brielle said, formatted, with annotations. Of course she did. He set the wrench in its slot. She annotated a grocery list once. I didn't ask her to. She felt it was necessary. She's going to run something someday, Brielle said. I know. He finally looked up. I just hope she lets me retire first. Brielle laughed, and the evening light came through the garage entrance, and they were standing approximately 4 feet apart in a driveway in Eastlake, and she was thinking about something she'd been thinking about in the spaces between other things for several months. Can I ask you something? She said. He set down the rag. You always ask if you can ask, he said. You've never waited for the answer. I'm waiting now. He looked at her. Something in the quality of the moment registered in his face, not alarm, but the particular attentiveness of a person who has learned to read the room and knows when the room has changed. Go ahead, he said. She looked at him steadily. Are we ever going to talk about what this is? A silence. Not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that has weight, that both people are holding carefully. I don't know, he said. And then, after a beat, I've been thinking about it. So have I. He leaned against the workbench. He looked at the floor for a moment, not avoiding her, just doing the thing he did when he was organizing his thoughts before he said them out loud. I don't move fast, he said. I don't know how to do that. After Claire died, he stopped. He never talked about his wife directly. Claire was a name Brielle had heard once, from Sadie, who'd said it with the particular careful ease of a child who had grown up with an absence long enough to carry it without stumbling. I stopped assuming things would go a certain way. I stopped planning past a certain horizon, not because I gave up, just because it felt irresponsible to assume. He looked up at her. And then I started to feel like that was the right way to live. Don't overplan. Be where you are. That's not a small thing to unlearn, Brielle said. No. He was quiet. You're the first person in a long time who made me want to think past the horizon again. He said it flatly, without performance, the way he said everything like a fact he'd verified and was now reporting. That's not nothing. I just don't know what to do with it yet. She looked at him for a long moment. Then don't do anything with it, she said. I'm not going anywhere. He held her gaze. You're very busy. I'm always very busy. I'm also here in your driveway on a Saturday evening. She paused. Those things coexist. Something in his expression shifted, a slow, real shift, the kind that comes from the inside, rather than being placed there for someone else's benefit. I burned the pancakes this morning, he said. It was entirely without context. She blinked. What? Sadie wanted pancakes. I've made pancakes approximately 300 times. I burned them this morning because I was thinking about something else. He looked at her with a directness that was almost uncomfortable in its clarity. I was thinking about what you said on Thursday, about the program design. I was thinking about it, and I burned the pancakes. The Thursday call had been 20 minutes. Financial program logistics. She'd said perhaps 4 things that could be described as memorable. Which part? She said. The part where you said the only metrics that matter are the ones that show whether people's lives are actually different. He paused. You said it like it was obvious, but most people in your position don't think that way. Most people in my position measure what's easy to measure, she said. That's different from measuring what matters. Yeah. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at the park, not at the situation, not at the problem, but at her specifically. Taking in something he was still finding the full edges of. Sadie told you the books you sent had good taste. I remember. She also told me. He stopped. He looked briefly, like a man deciding how far to go. She told me she hoped you'd come to her birthday in July. Brielle was very still. She didn't tell me she was going to tell you that, he said. She tends to freelance these things, I noticed. I wasn't going to pressure you, Elias. She said his name the way she'd said it in the car outside North Star, that first night carefully, meaning it. I'd like to come to her birthday. He looked at her. He exhaled once, slowly, like something had been held in longer than he'd realized. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. And then Sadie came out the front door with her jacket half on and her bag over one shoulder and the particular purposeful energy of someone who has a bookshop to get to and does not understand why the adults are standing in the driveway staring at each other. Are you guys done? She said. Yes, Brielle said. What were you talking about? Pancakes, Elias said. Sadie looked at him with the expression she reserved for answers she found inadequate. Okay, she said with elaborate patience. Can we go now? They went. Sadie's birthday was a small thing, 7 kids from school, a cake that Elias had attempted himself and that leaned noticeably to one side, pizza, and a backyard in Eastlake that was not large, but had been cleaned up for the occasion with the concentrated effort of a man who had spent the preceding Saturday doing it. Brielle arrived with 3 carefully chosen books and a gift card to the bookshop that she'd added at the last minute because she'd thought a gift card was impersonal, and then reversed course because Sadie would find it practical, and Sadie valued practicality. She stood in the backyard with a paper plate and watched Elias manage 7 10-year-olds with the same systematic calm he'd brought to Hawthorne Park, reading the dynamics, solving small problems before they became larger ones, keeping things moving without making it obvious that he was keeping things moving. Good at it. He was, she thought, genuinely good at being a father. Not in a performed way, in the way that came from having made it the central project of his life and having given it the same focused attention he gave everything else. Helen, the grandmother, Claire's mother, a small and precise woman with silver hair and the kind of eyes that took inventory quickly, came to stand next to Brielle with her own paper plate. "He talks about you," Helen said, without preamble. Brielle looked at her. "Does he?" "Not directly. Elias doesn't say things directly, if he can avoid it." Gustav watched him redirect 2 children who were arguing about a ball. "He mentions things. Something you said, something you noticed. The way you handled something at the program review." She paused. "He hasn't mentioned anyone in 6 years." Brielle absorbed this. "I know that's not a small thing," she said. "No," Helen said. "It isn't." She looked at Brielle steadily. The assessment was frank and unhurried, and Brielle let it happen because it was warranted. "He gave up a great deal to be here doing this. I want to make sure you understand that. Not as a warning, just as context. I understand it," Brielle said. "Think about it." Helen was quiet for a moment. "Sadie told me you came to her volunteer day. That you answered her questions without simplifying. She would have noticed. She always does." Helen looked at her granddaughter, who was currently explaining something to 2 of her friends with considerable authority. "She's going to be a handful when she's 15. She's a handful now," Brielle said. "Yes," Helen said. "She really is." And something in her voice was warm in the particular way of people who find the handful worth it. He asked her to marry him in October, exactly 1 year after the park. She knew something was happening because he'd called on a Tuesday and said he'd like to take a walk Saturday evening, which was an unusual phrasing. They didn't usually announce walks. They just went places together now. 3 of them, or the 2 of them, in the organic way of people whose lives had become genuinely interwoven. The particular deliberateness of "I'd like to take a walk" told her something, though she didn't know the specifics. He took her to Hawthorne Park. She understood as soon as they entered from the north path, because she knew his mind well enough by now to know that he did not make arbitrary choices about locations. Everything he did had a reason. He just didn't always say the reason out loud. It was colder than the year before. Clear, though one of those rare Seattle October nights where the sky actually showed stars, and the lamplight along the east path fell on the stone the same way it had that first night. She hadn't been back to the park since. She hadn't avoided it deliberately. It simply hadn't come up, and she hadn't sought it out. Walking in now, she felt the year between layered over what she remembered: the 5 men, the fountain, the bench. And then all the months afterward folded into that same geography. The way a place can hold multiple versions of itself simultaneously. He walked her to the east path, to the bench. His jacket, the worn brown canvas, won $40 from a surplus store. The one she'd teased him about replacing more than once was folded on the bench's far end. He stopped. He turned and looked at her. He was not a man who made speeches. She knew that. She'd heard him be concise in situations where other people would have filled the space with words, because he believed that extra words were usually a form of insecurity, saying more than necessary to compensate for not trusting what you'd already said. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this correctly for about 4 months, he said. "I don't think there's a correct version." "Then say the honest version," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I spent 6 years being careful, being present for Sadie, not planning past a certain point because I thought that was the responsible way to live." He paused. "You walked into this park a year ago, and I walked across it because I didn't have a choice, not because of training or instinct, but because watching you and not acting was impossible. And everything after that has been I keep waiting for it to feel like less than it is. It doesn't." She held very still. "I'm not easy to be with," he said. I have a daughter who will interrogate every decision you make and annotate your grocery lists. I burn pancakes when I'm distracted. I don't go to places that require reservations more than 6 weeks out. I keep a jacket that cost $40 because I can't think of a good reason to throw it away." He paused. "I'm not going to be a different person than this." "I know," she said. "I'm asking for this person." He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a ring. It was simple, a single stone, clean setting, nothing ostentatious. She would find out later that he'd spent 3 weeks looking before he found one that seemed right, and that Sadie had been present for the final decision and had approved it with the firm authority she brought to all important matters. "Will you marry me?" he said. She looked at him in the lamplight, the same bench, the folded jacket at its end, like a deliberate marker of something that had started in this exact spot and had been moving, steadily and without fanfare, ever since. "Yes," she said. And then, from behind the stone fountain, because Sadie had insisted on being present, and had further insisted on a specific dramatic entrance, which Elias had negotiated down from her original concept, but not eliminated entirely, came a small figure in a winter coat, holding 3 paper cups with plastic lids, moving with the careful concentration of someone transporting something important. "I have hot chocolate," Sadie announced. "I've been behind the fountain for 14 minutes and it was cold, and I'm just saying that for the record." Brielle laughed, the real kind, the full kind, the kind that came from somewhere that had been a little closed for a long time and was now genuinely open. Elias took 2 of the cups from Sadie with the patience of a man who had accepted, completely, that his life would always include someone providing real-time commentary on it. "Thank you," he said. 14 minutes was excellent dedication. "I know," Sadie said. She looked at Brielle. "Did you say yes?" "I said yes," Brielle confirmed. Sadie nodded, in the manner of someone whose expectations have been met. "Good," she said. "I already have opinions about the cake." They married the following June. Small ceremony. 40 people, outdoor, in the backyard of a friend's property north of the city, where the trees came down to a lawn, and the light in the late afternoon came through them in the particular way that made everything look unhurried. No elaborate production. Elias had been clear about that, and Brielle had found that she agreed with more of his instincts about this than she'd expected she'd imagined. In some abstract earlier version of herself, ever got married, it would be a significant event. And it was. It just wasn't large. Ruth was there. Helen was there. Marcus, who had given his resignation effective 6 weeks after the wedding with a gracious letter, was there. He'd decided to open a small security consulting firm, and Brielle had given him the North Star account as his first client, which was the right thing to do, and also the practical thing, which she'd long believed was usually the same thing. Claudia was there. Paulson came, which surprised Brielle and didn't surprise Elias, who had apparently developed a straightforward working respect with the detective over the months of trial proceedings. Sadie was the one who, in the absence of any other organizing principle, positioned herself between both of them during the ceremony with the proprietary calm of someone who considered this entire event to be, in large part, her own doing, which was not entirely wrong. She was 10 now, and she was already more than both of them, and they both knew it. The years that followed were not a story. That's the thing that nobody tells you about the life you've been working toward, that when you arrive at it, it stops being a story and starts being a life, which is different. Lives have repetition and Tuesday evenings and arguments about whether the heat should go on before November and someone burning dinner again, and a child who grows into a person with her own plans that don't always include the people who raised her as much as those people would like. Elias didn't go back to the work he'd left. He'd been clear about that from the beginning, and it didn't change. He took on a formal training role through the city's emergency response program, a part-time contract that let him contribute his experience without reassembling the version of himself he'd deliberately put down. He still did maintenance work. He still restored cars on weekends, in a garage that now had better equipment because Brielle had pointed out, once, with no particular pressure, that good tools were an investment rather than an indulgence. And he'd thought about it for 2 weeks and then bought the press he'd been not buying for 4 years. Brielle remained CEO of North Star for 7 more years before promoting her COO and stepping into a board role. Not because she was tired of it, She was never really tired of the work, but because she'd built something that genuinely ran without her being at its center every day, and she'd learned enough to recognize that as the real completion of it. The thing Elias had said in the community center basement, the only kind worth building. North Star's internal reporting channel had, by the end of her tenure, received and resolved 43 reports of financial or compliance irregularities. Not all of them were significant. Several were. 3 had been serious enough to prevent problems that, unaddressed, would have become the kind of problem that Dorian Kessler had been. She kept that number in a private document, not for credit. Just because it was the number that told the real story of what those 47 audit pages had made possible. Elias still owned the jacket. It hung in the front closet, on a hook near the door, where it had lived for years in a household that had grown around it. Brielle had teased him about it intermittently, not seriously, because she understood by now exactly what the jacket represented to him, and the teasing was the way she engaged with things she found genuinely moving without making them heavy. "It's disintegrating," she said, one evening in the coat closet. "It's not disintegrating," he said. "It's worn. The left elbow has a hole in it." "It's a small hole, Elias. You could buy 5 new jackets for what you paid for that one." He looked at it. He looked at her. "No," he said simply. She knew why. She'd known for a long time. Because the jacket had been on a bench in a park when something started. Because he'd folded it with the specific care of a man who always put things in order before walking into something he didn't know the outcome of, and it had been sitting there on that bench in the lamplight when she'd first understood that the man in front of her was not what he appeared to be, from the outside not the maintenance worker, not the figure in worn work clothes, not the ordinary man in a park at the wrong time. The jacket was the marker. It said, "This is where it started, and this is what it cost to get here, and the cost was worth it." She reached out and straightened it on the hook. "Fine," she said. "Keep it." "I intend to," he said. They closed the closet door. There is a particular kind of person who moves through the world without announcing themselves. Who does the hard thing because it's the right thing and doesn't need anyone to witness the doing of it. Who has survived something significant enough to reshape them, and instead of wearing that survival as a credential, simply carries it quietly into the ordinary rooms of an ordinary life. The world has a tendency to overlook these people, to register what they're wearing instead of what they are, to read the surface and assume the depth is consistent with it, to see the jacket and not see the person inside it. 5 men in a park looked at Elias Mercer on a cold Thursday in October and saw a maintenance worker in worn clothes. They saw someone marginal, someone who could be warned away with a look. They saw the jacket. They had no idea what they'd walked into. And what they'd walked into was not a former Navy SEAL with 11 years of operational experience, though that was true. What they'd walked into was a man who had decided, years before that night, that the most important thing he could do with the rest of his life was be present for a 9-year-old girl who needed her father, who had calibrated everything: the jobs he took, the hours he kept, the risks he accepted, and the ones he walked away from around that single central fact. A man like that, when he decides to step in, doesn't step in halfway, because he's not doing it to be seen. He's doing it because the calculation is simple and the answer is clear, and he has never been the kind of person who could see a clear answer and choose to look somewhere else. Brielle Langford had built a company from nothing. She had created jobs, developed technology that went into medical systems across the country, navigated hostile investors and internal betrayals, and the specific loneliness of being the person in a room everyone else looks to. She had done all of it through intelligence and work and the particular brand of stubbornness that gets called termination when it succeeds. And then one night, in a park she'd crossed 100 times, she'd stood behind a stone fountain and watched a man she'd never met make himself into a wall between her and the thing coming toward her, not because he'd been hired or asked or had any stake in the outcome, but because he'd looked at the situation and made the only decision that was consistent with who he was. She'd spent her career in rooms where people said the right things, and built structures that looked like integrity and smiled across conference tables at the numbers that made everyone comfortable. She'd learned in 3 years of building a company that the people most eager to talk about their values are frequently the ones with the least access to them when the cost goes up. Elias never talked about his values. He just acted in accordance with them, consistently, in the large things and the small ones, and the pattern was so clear and so unbroken that after a while it stopped feeling like behavior and started feeling like nature. She had not expected to find that in a park. She had not expected to find it at all, if she was honest. She'd made a kind of private peace with the idea that the particular combination of clarity and warmth and steadiness she'd have wanted was probably not a realistic expectation, that you could have people who were clear, or people who were warm, or people who were steady, but all three in one person, and someone who also didn't want anything from her that she didn't want to give, was asking too much of probability. She had been wrong about that. She would acknowledge freely, occasionally wrong about things. This was, of all her errors, the one she was most glad to have made. Years later, a journalist writing a profile of North Star's legacy under Brielle's leadership asked her, in a closing question, whether she could identify the moment that had most shaped her approach to leadership and decision-making. She thought about what to say. She thought about the honest answer, which was complicated and personal, and involved a park and a bench and a jacket, and a man who burned pancakes and kept every drawing his daughter ever gave him. There was a moment, she said carefully, when someone made a decision that cost them something, that put something they valued at genuine risk, for a reason that had nothing to do with how it would look or what they'd get from it, just because it was the right thing to do. She paused. I'd been in boardrooms for years at that point. I knew how people talked about integrity. Watching someone actually exercise it, under real pressure, with no audience, recalibrated something for me. About what it means and what it actually costs. The journalist asked who she was talking about. She smiled. Someone I know, she said. She closed her notebook and went home. Sadie was at university by then, studying political science with the particular intensity of someone who had been forming opinions about systemic structure since she was 9 years old. Called on Sundays, usually for too long, and then suddenly not long enough, and her calls arrived with the news of her week delivered in the rapid, dense style of a person who had a lot to say and had inherited her father's disinclination to waste words. Elias answered those calls in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, and a look on his face that Brielle had come to understand as his version of contentment, not the performed kind, not the kind that needed anyone to witness it, but the real and quiet kind that lives in the specific ordinariness of a Sunday evening in a kitchen you know well. She'd watch him from the doorway sometimes, just for a moment, not announcing herself. He always knew she was there. He'd glance over mid-conversation with Sadie and find her in the doorway, and something in his face would settle the way things settle when they've found the position they were supposed to be in. He wouldn't say anything. He didn't have to. She'd come into the kitchen and put the kettle on and stay.